J.T. Crowley is Talking Books. On this show, you'll hear from emerging talent and seasoned veterans from around the world. They'll give you their take on the writing process and how to create the secret sauce of page-turning deliciousness. Let's get into that magical mixture of the art and science of creativity. Here's J.T. Crowley, author of The Smart Kids, and your podcast host.
Hello, everyone. I'm J.T. Crowley, and today I'm delighted to welcome Wayne Edwards from the state of Montana in the United States. He describes himself as a multi-genre author, as his books are aimed at different age ranges with varying storylines. Predominantly, the books are aimed at the very young to the young mid-grade students in school age. And we're going to talk about a couple of his books, Buster the Bridger Mountain Bear, who's aimed at very young children, Pacer Cooley Chronicles, who's aimed at the mid-grade children and adults. And briefly, we're going to touch upon his latest book that he's working on, A Stone's Throw, which he hopes will be out shortly. Wayne, it's a tremendous pleasure to talk to you about your books, so I would like to welcome you on the show. Come and join me.
John, happy to be here. Happy to be with you.
Brilliant. Wayne, can you tell the listeners, the viewers, a little bit about yourself and why you write?
Well, John, as you mentioned, I'm from the state of Montana in the United States. That's a northern state up bordering Alberta and Saskatchewan, Canada, and we're a very large state geographically, the fourth largest state in the Union, but yet only one state, our neighboring Wyoming, is of less population than we are. To give you a little example, square miles wise, we're 3 times as large as England from a square mile acreage, and we just hit 1 million people in total population here 4 or 5 years ago. So we're basically an agricultural rural state. Largest city in our state is just barely over 100,000. So that gives you a little flavor of where about Montana and where I grew up. And even more so, speaking of the rural aspect, I grew up in the center of the state, which is wheat and cattle country, at a very small little town. And let me just tell you what small means in my vernacular. Many people think a town of 300,000 is small. They would certainly think 30,000 is small, and would think 3,000 would be super small. And so the town I grew up in and spent most of my working life in was a town of 300 people. So we are definitely talking, very, very rural. And the county that we live in is larger than the state of Connecticut, but yet there's only 10,000 people in the entire county. So we are indeed rural. And so again, I was born and raised in this little town called Denton up in central Montana. And upon getting my higher education, I ended up returning to that town and worked for 30 years in the little family-owned bank that my grandfather started in 1929. And so that's pretty much my background. And Pacer Cooley, that book is based upon my experience there, as well as being a banker. I did what you generally do in small towns is you do whatever you're asked to do to help your community. And so I even spent a 6-year stint as the as the head football coach at our little high school, and that really is the basis of the book Pacer Cooley Chronicles. It's not totally about that, but it's a fiction story, but it's based on my experience there in that rural small town as the football coach there.
It sure is a small rural community, and when you read the books, everybody, this is the Pacer Cooley book. But before we start on to look at that one, I want to go to your book, Buster, the Bridger Mountain Bear. Now, this is for very young kids. It's an illustrated book. The pictures in here are absolutely fabulous. And there are 12 endearing animal characters, all of which can be found in the wilds of Montana. So this is all about where Wayne comes from, the wildlife there, and the simple little story here is just absolutely so sweet and endearing. Why did you write this story? Why did you write Buster? Spill the beans here.
Well, Buster came about because Buster was a bedtime story that I had made up with numerous adaptations over the years, but that I told countless times to our 3 daughters and subsequently our 8 grandchildren. And when I retired from the bank, my 3 daughters encouraged me to write actually the concept of Buster, and secondly the concept of which ended up to be Pacer Cooley. But to be honest with you, John, I think they were simply afraid that I was going to drive their mother crazy by being around the house all the time with nothing to do in my retirement. So they said, Dad, I think you need to why don't you get Buster put on paper and do a little book. So that's how Buster came about.
I mean, when you look at Buster, he's a black bear, and he's got himself in a bit of predicament here. And, you've got all these 12 characters. You've got Billy the Bobcat, you've got Brutus the Badger, Mortimer, Moose, Oliver Wendell Owl the Third, Katerina Cat the Cougar, and of course Buster the Bear, plus all the other characters. Now, they're all there because Buster's got his head stuck somewhere, and they're all working together like any animals would do as a community to sort Buster out. Just give us a little flavour here, Wayne, as to what the storyline is, but don't give the plot away.
Well, basically, Buster he's a young black bear, as you mentioned, and he's curious. And so he's sniffing around for honey, insects, whatever, and ends up sticking his head in a fallen log and gets his head stuck, can't get out. And so Gabby Gopher, who is the main social director in the entire mountain, she's a bit of a gossip. She's pretty nosy.
She is.
But she also has a heart of gold, and she's very willing to help anybody in need. So she finds Buster in his predicament first, and she orchestrates the recovery, so to speak, or the escape from Buster from the log. And without giving the story away, it involves all of these animals that you just mentioned, starting with, in particular, with the sagest animal or bird on the mountain, who is Oliver Wendell Owl the Third, who all the animals go to when they need some advice. And so he develops a plan, and all of these animals are brought in together, and they work collectively with a lot of teamwork involved to get Buster's head unstuck from that log.
Even grumpy Brutus the Badger.
Even Brutus joined.
Absolutely. I mean, did you enjoy? Did you enjoy working with Gina Dorr as the illustrator here?
Oh, she was wonderful, and this was my first children's book. And Gina is she's an awesome artist and has her own studio and where we live now in Bozeman, Montana, and so I knew her and was an admirer of her work. And so when I started to think about who am I going to get to illustrate this, I thought, well, I'll give Gina a call. And I didn't think she'd ever done anything like that. And indeed, once I got a hold of her, she said, no, I've never done any illustrations or children's illustrations. But she said, I love the idea and let's give it a go. Yeah.
Let's give it a go.
Exactly. Yeah. As you said, she did a wonderful job. And the most important thing in any children's book is the illustrator.
She brought the characters to life.
That's what brings the whole book to life.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Wayne, I want to move on to your next book, Pacer Cooley Chronicles, which for me is aimed at slightly older children, more young teens, and possibly adults. Now, this is a chunky book, everyone, with a fair number of chapters. So as to give you all a flavour and an insight, so to speak, we're going to concentrate on 7 or 8 of the chapters. For me, Wayne, the chapters Edna's meeting with Lester and Edna's second meeting with Lester caught my eye. Edna, now for me, Edna is the domineering matrix head of school. She's used to getting her way with what she wants. She rules the roost. That's her type of character she is. And she very much, Wayne, reminded me of Miss Trunchbull, the headmistress in Roald Dahl's Matilda. And I hope you don't mind me making the comparison there, because she just did, and that's why I want to talk about these 2 chapters. And of course, Lester is the athletics director of sport at the school, and he's under the cosh for poor performance. Tell us about these 2 chapters. What's the significance here? I just loved them.
Well, again, to begin with, Edna is an iconic character in this, and the fictional Pacer Cooley is very much like my original little town of Denton. It's a little small rural town up in central Montana, also of 300 people. And so she's lived there all her life. She's 72 years old. She's at a very young age. Her father died, and she took over. She ran the ranch there. She was a English teacher at the school, at the high school there for almost 50 years. And upon retiring from teaching, she's now runs the school with an iron fist as the school board chairperson. And so
sure does.
Edna is extremely, as you mentioned, she's pretty hard-headed, and she's very demanding, and she believes in education and not only in education, but she's a big time sports fan. And so what gets into these chapters was several years prior, she had hired Lester Brewster as the superintendent of the school. And as what often happens when you go to a small school, now again, there's only 100 kids from kindergarten all the way through senior and high school. So he has to wear a lot of hats. It's not just not only the superintendent, he's the grade school and high school principal, he's the girls basketball coach, he's the girls volleyball coach. But unfortunately, in Edna's eyes, with him also being the athletic director, it was his responsibility to hire the last football coach. So Edna had been very unhappy with the Pacer Cooley. It had a long-standing tradition, starting with her uncle back in the 30s when he coached the team, and so she got used to a good solid tradition of football in particular.
She didn't like being beaten by those goddamn Catholics, did she?
She didn't like the downward spiral of the football program over the last 5 years. And I love how you mentioned the goddamn Catholics. There was the biggest rival between Pacer Cooley was a little private Catholic school called St. Francis. And over the last number of years, they had been very good in all sports, but in particular in football. And it seemed that the Pacer Cooley had only beaten them like once in the last 10 years, and that did not go over very well with Edna. And Edna called them, she wouldn't even call them St. Francis. And it's not that she had anything against the Catholic religion at all, even though she was Methodist, but she would refer to them as the goddamn Catholics, and she was getting pretty tired of getting beat on a regular basis like a drum by the goddamn Catholics. So she, at this first meeting with Lester, who had hired this coach that had a bunch of losing seasons, she said, "You are going to fire him immediately. And we're going to begin the search for a new football coach. And we're going to turn this thing around, and we're going to beat the goddamn Catholics." And secondly, since you hired yourself as AD to be the girls basketball and volleyball coach, with all the talent that we had last year, with 3 of your daughters, the Brewster girls, and with a 4th one coming into high school the following year, all of his girls were talented, but there was a lot of nitpicking going on. There was some jealousy, and when they got to the tournaments and were playing the good teams, this all got in the way of.
We'll talk about the Brewster sisters later.
Right, and so she promptly fired Lester from the head basketball and volleyball coach, and told him to begin his search for those positions as well.
She sure did. She's a very dominating matrix, is Edna. Let's go to, I loved the chapter, Luke and Madison. Luke and Madison discover the Pacer Cooley Chronicles, this chapter. Now, they're both divorced, recently moved to Pacer Cooley High School. So how and why did you create these characters? You have them living side by side. They like their barbecues. They like their food. So I thought, what's their role in the overall plot here? And what goes on in the Chronicles is very interesting, isn't it? Spill again.
Yeah, they're really certainly a main feature of the story, the 2 of them, as the book really follows the football season and the girls basketball seasons, which in those years, the era, by the way, of Pacer Cooley this book is written at 1990, so 30 some years ago. And so what they ended up doing was, as you mentioned, coming off some tough divorce situations. Both of them wanted to change, and without knowing each other before they got there, they both ended up taking the head coaching positions that were open. You mentioned the side-by-side rentals, which, by the way, are owned by Edna, and so both of them are, a little bit gun shy because of their recent divorces. There certainly seems to be an immediate attraction between the two of them. Madison has a delightful little 11-year-old daughter that Luke becomes immediately he really likes her, and they develop a good relationship long before he ever trusts himself to really try to like Madison and take that to the next step, if you will.
Of course, and Rosie's her daughter, her 11-year-old daughter. Yeah.
Yeah. So then we get into, as they're talking back and forth over the fence and the barbecues and so forth, they come across the small town newspaper. Madison is familiar with small town newspapers because she's from another small town up in northern Montana. But Luke has always been at big schools, whether in Nebraska, whether he was when he was a student and when he was coaching. And so he's quite unfamiliar with the ways of small community life. So he gets the first look at this small town newspaper. It's only published, an edition is only published twice a week. And once a month, there is, for every little surrounding town, and there's 7 or 8 of these little small towns that are about the same size as Pacer Coulee, and each of them has a correspondent, and they send in the local community news from their community. And it essentially ends up being kind of a little gossip column. And
now wait on that one, because we'll come to that, Wayne, because we'll come to Ethel. Hold on fire there, everyone. This is good, but we'll do this on Ethel. But I want to go to first, before we get to Ethel, the baker, the good pies. I want to go to Dolph and Earl. I have questions for Luke, that chapter. Now, Dolph is an interesting character. He's slightly different to all those around him due to his mental limitations. He's always anxious to know if he's on the bad list or not. And how has he avoided it this week? And then you've got Earl. Now, Earl, you have given this character, this boy, a little bit of a stammer. And he's trying to manipulate his way around Luke here by trying to say he's a lot heavier than what the figures say. And he's also a little bit taller than what the figures say, so he can get into the teams. Now, I get the sense that these two boys are trying to impress all the time to show that their disabilities are not a distraction and that they're as good as anybody else on the sports field. Am I right here? And this is what these two characters are about?
It's very typical of small towns or small schools where when you're at a bigger school, the freshmen play on a freshman team, sophomores play on a sophomore team or a JV team, and you usually don't play varsity until you're, a junior, right? And junior and senior. Well, when you get to a small school, like we're talking about here at Pacer Coulee, there's only 17 total boys out for football for an 8-man football team. And a whole bunch of them are going to end up being freshmen or sophomores. So they're really certainly not quite ready for prime time yet, right? And but as a coach, Luke's having to deal particularly with Earl. He's a scrawny little young freshman who wants nothing more than to grow 5 inches, 6, 7, 8 inches taller. He'd love to be 6'2" and 220 pounds, and unfortunately he's 5'2" and 97 pounds. So
bit of a difference.
So he comes in before the first game, and he's been looking at the roster that the secretary has been printing out to send to the neighboring school that they're going to play in the opening game, and of course sees that where he's listed. So he tries to manipulate Luke into, hey, mom's been cooking a lot more. You've got us weightlifting. I'm sure I'm going to be, by the end of the season, no doubt I'm going to be 5'5", and I'll probably be 106 to 108 pounds, and so he's just wondering, couldn't we just go ahead and adjust that on the roster right now? So, and so here's Luke, who's used to coaching in big schools and not coaching freshmen. And so this is a whole new deal to him, but he handles it wonderfully. And they do, in fact, make an adjustment on the roster. I think they get him up.
And we'll leave it at that, everyone.
Yeah.
Now, Wayne, now you can come to Mrs. Grove, Ethel. Now, she's the elder. This is a lovely chapter, everybody. Mrs. Grove and the Pacer Cooley Chronicles. Ooh, yeah. Ethel is the elderly lady, famed for her pies, everyone. She's telling Sylvia Graham, the correspondent on the Pacer Cooley Chronicles, the local paper, how Luke and Madison are really, listen to this, really good neighbours. Well, there's nothing like a bit of juicy hot gossip to get the tongues wagging in the local community, never mind all the other boring stuff that's been printed. She's a bit of a gossip, isn't she?
Of course, and that's another one of the treasures of the small town correspondent. As you mentioned, pretty soon you're in a agricultural community, so they start with the weather. They start with how are the wheat and barley crops, what are cattle prices like, and then once you get past that, you got to fill in the rest of your column somehow, right? And so Sylvia, the correspondent, she's been around the block a few times, and so the old gals that have some juicy news give her a call, and that's what happened. Mrs. Grove, who lives right across the alley from Madison and Luke, she gives them a call, and she sees a little romance possibly starting there, and she doesn't really come out and say that, but she makes sure she says what a wonderful young neighbors they are and how
really good neighbors. Yes. And we'll leave that story there, because if you want to know what really goes on in that chapter, everyone, go and read the book. Let's go, Wayne, to, I like this one because this is really a community, the rural community working together. I love this chapter, Wayne. Edna gets a visit from the sheriff. Now, she's not in trouble. It's all about how the local community pull together when they hear of the demise of the old man Hollister's accident at Spring Creek's Bridge. And Edna is asked to get involved to support Tank, one of the young lads at the school, who's on the Hollister farm. Now, this is life in rural Montana, isn't it, Wayne? All the community working together to support each other. And this is what it's about.
Absolutely. Tank, who's by far the best football player on the team, very strong, one of Montana's top recruiting prospects, and but he's come from a really tough home life. His father is a raging alcoholic who abused both him and his mother. So his whole life has been fraught by abuse, and Edna has kind of, in her own rough way, has had long ago sort of taken him under her wing, and the whole community, as you mentioned. So when the father, coming home drunk from one of the bars in Centertown, goes over the bridge into Spring Creek and dies, the sheriff knows that Edna kind of looks out for him, so he goes to Edna's home and before he goes to Tank, because Tank's the only offspring there, and says, "Hey, I just want you to know we just found Terrence Hollister Sr. Dead in the creek. I'm gonna have to go over and tell Tank now. Would you come with me?" And so what ends up resulting from that is that Edna and a few of the other town leaders and the whole community, as you say, has kind of looked out for him. But in particular, Edna and the main banker in town and Shanty, who we're going to get to, they all get together to take care of all of the funeral arrangements and what have you. And it's just classic what happens.
Community working together
in a small community when something like this happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now let's move on to the Brewster sisters. Luce, how shall I say it? Now, I love this chapter. This is Madison. We hear Madison. She's lost it with these three sisters, or these four sisters. They're spoiled. They're selfish. They're damn right uncoachable. They're the four Brewster sisters. They are Luke's, daughters. She's having a go at them, and she's not afraid to do that, is she? They're unruly.
She is not, and that again is another typical small town scenario where you have oftentimes a couple of siblings playing on the same team, certainly a bunch of cousins that are playing on the same team, and oftentimes it goes very well. I had three daughters myself, that two of which played on the same teams for a number of years. They got along just fine. So it can go very well, but it can also go south when a little bit of jealousy and nitpicking and what have you goes on. So Madison was able to control this early in the season, but the youngest girl, who was just a freshman and turned out to be probably the best player on the team, and that didn't go over very well with her older sisters, and they got to nitpicking, and we're not playing well together. And so as they get into the tournament, Madison has to sit them down and basically say, either you pull it together or play together, or I will not hesitate to just sit you on the bench for the entire tournament. And so she handled them beautifully, unlike Lester. Their dad was able to when he was coaching. She was able to come in, lay down the law, and the girls fortunately responded, and things went much better.
Sometimes it needs a woman, and I'm not being sexist here in any way, anybody, to deal with some troublesome daughters. And Absolutely. We'll say no more. Wayne, let's turn to your other book now. That's, shortly to come out, I believe, A Stone's Throw. Can you briefly tell us what this forthcoming book is about?
Well, A Stone's Throw is intended for I would say an upper middle grade audience, meaning like 11 to 14 years old is the target audience for that book. And basically what the story is about, it takes place in the 1960s. That's the era. And it's about a 12-year-old girl who is shuttled from a San Francisco orphanage to a remote eastern Montana ranch to live with a grandfather that she has never met. And it becomes quite the challenge for both of them. The grandfather is a World War I vet, homesteaded his ground, tough old bird like that generation was. And all of a sudden he's widowed, living by himself, and all of a sudden he's tasked with having a 12-year-old granddaughter around the house. And so he's just as scared as she is. And believe me, she's plenty nervous, coming from a San Francisco environment to something totally different. And it's enjoying, I think, a charming, I hope, journey for the both of them.
Oh, indeed. So let's have a look at, again, this is going to be quite a chunky books with a lot of chapters. So let's have a look at two of the chapters here, Wayne, in this book. Now, these chapters are next to each other, everybody. The trip to Montana comes first, which is about the journey from San Francisco to Montana. And then the following chapter is the first day on the ranch, which you start by saying, it was dark when we arrived at the ranch. As we drove down a dirt lane towards the house and outbuildings, I could see from the dim yard light that a dog was racing towards the car. And for Maggie, the main character here, you're saying that this chapter is a shock to the system for Maggie. And that's why you wanted to talk about it. Tell us about these two chapters.
Yes, and, I think first the trip to Montana, she is totally surprised when her grandfather, Ira Stone, shows up at the orphanage to basically claim her as a relative, which is the only way she could really get out of the orphanage. And so she's shocked, first of all, because she's never met him. In fact, she wouldn't have really known if he was dead or alive. And so that was a shock to begin with. And then she starts the long journey, the 2-day journey from San Francisco, California to the fictional town of Sandstone Springs, Montana, which is 2 long days in the car. She realizes as they're going along there, my gosh, we're going to stay at the same motel room tonight. This guy is scary. He was wounded in World War I, has a large, took some shrapnel on the cheek, so he's got a long, deep scar on one side of his face, so he kind of looks like a bit like a monster. And so she's obviously, as a little 12-year-old girl, she is frightened, and he doesn't know what to say. She tries to initiate some conversation. He's having none of it, not because he doesn't want to, he just doesn't know how. And so that's a scary 2 days for her, realizing that she's leaving her whole old life in San Francisco behind. The first day on the ranch, I think, points out a little bit of her resiliency, and she's all of a sudden, for living in a rental in San Francisco, they didn't even have a dog, didn't have a cat, and all of a sudden here's a dog racing up the lane as they come in there. Before you know it, she's doing chores. I mean, there's no fooling around with Ira. He says, you got to work. Ranch people do, and so pretty soon she's gathering eggs and cleaning chicken houses, and she's out bottle feeding orphan calves and getting introduced into the whole ranch life and animals. And so I think that chapter just shows the stark contrast of her former life and to what she's suddenly been thrust into.
There you go, everyone. There's a bit of insight to the next book. Thank you, Wayne, for these wonderful stories, on letting us, giving us a glimpse into your world of books and writing. Who do you see, Wayne, as the market for your books? Or more importantly, who would you like to see reading your books? Everybody? Just kids? Who?
Well, I think, obviously the children's book could be any audience. You really don't have to live in the country to appreciate the Buster story, I don't think. I would think with Pacer Cooley, I think anybody that likes sports, certainly anybody that's growing up in a rural setting, whether it be in Montana or anywhere across the Midwest or in rural England, I think people might enjoy it, or rural
Canada,
Australia, or or whatever. I mean, I don't think you have to be from Montana and from a rural town in Montana to enjoy it. But I do think that probably the target audience is people that, because it is a book that's fairly concentrated on sports. If you're a sports fan, I think you'd enjoy it. And it's obviously an older audience. I tell people there is some rough language in Pacer Cooley. It's certainly not a politically correct book. We laugh about ourselves. There's Brit characters in there. There's Irish characters, and I think the one nice thing that the book does is back in the days, I think it takes us back into the days where we can actually laugh at ourselves a little bit, without having to be so politically proper. So I think I tell people that's probably a PG rated book. I think older high school kids and an adult will enjoy that book. I think A Stone's Throw, of course, the intended audience of 11 through 14 is certainly who I'm hoping for there. But I also think it's a book that adults would enjoy. It's kind of a delightful, charming story, and I don't think you have to be 14 to enjoy it. I think an adult would as well.
Where can people get your books from, Wayne?
Well, you can go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Goodreads. They're available on all of those. They're available as an ebook. And I also have a website that you can go to and purchase them off of that.
Brilliant. Wayne Edwards, thank you very much. As I say at the end of my podcasts every week, I'm JT Crowley. Thanks for listening, watching, wherever you are in the world. So until next time, stay safe.